It started right after dismissal near Bowen High, when sneakers scraped pavement, voices rose, somebody tripped, and rifle fire cut daylight sharp enough to freeze everything moving. Kids scattered toward alleys and porches, while bodies dropped where they stood, with nobody understanding who was chasing whom or why it happened there. That moment felt sudden, yet it carried weight from years earlier, shaped by old grudges, passed down names, and streets trained to remember everything. Before cameras, before charges, before headlines, there were choices stacking quietly, teaching young dudes what lines not to cross, then daring them anyway. To understand that afternoon, you'll have to step backward, long before anyone thought this would turn into a war. Long before shootings tied these names together, Chicago already had lines drawn by race, housing, and survival, pushing young people into tight crews early. On the South Side during the late 1950s, Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston built the Blackstone Rangers around Woodlawn, pulling teenagers together for protection and influence. That crew grew fast through the 1960s, absorbing smaller groups, using strict rank systems, loyalty rules, and neighborhood control to stay organized. By the late 1960s, the name shifted toward Black P. Stone Nation, mixing street structure with religious language and heavy discipline. Fort pushed hierarchy hard, enforcing obedience through rewards, penalties, and reputation, which shaped how Stones moved inside neighborhoods and later inside prison yards. The Stones were not just a street crew, but a network, split into sets with generals, soldiers, and clear chains of command. Symbols mattered early, including pyramids, crescents, and the 5-point star, which signaled affiliation without speaking. During the early 1970s, parts of the organization rebranded as El Rukn, adding Islamic framing while expanding criminal reach. Federal attention followed, especially after Fort's connection to foreign funding plots, leading to his 1987 conviction and permanent imprisonment. Once Fort disappeared from the streets, Stone leadership fractured, leaving semi-independent sets operating on shared identity rather than central authority. While that was unfolding on the South Side, Puerto Rican youth on the West Side were building something different under similar pressure. The Latin Kings started during the 1950s in areas like Humboldt Park, responding to racial violence and exclusion from white-dominated blocks. They built discipline early through written codes, formal meetings, ranking systems, and strict consequences for disloyal behavior. By the 1970s, the almighty Latin King Nation stretched across Chicago, pulling in Mexican-American members and expanding territory. Kings emphasized unity, respect, and obedience, teaching recruits that structure was survival, not decoration. Unlike the Stones, the Latin Kings maintained a tighter centralized leadership longer, especially inside prisons. They enforced rules aggressively, sometimes through internal beatings or executions, which built fear but also cohesion. Leadership figures like Gustavo Colon later ran operations from prison, reinforcing how incarceration never stopped street influence. By the mid-80s, the Kings controlled blocks across Humboldt Park, Pilsen, Little Village, South Chicago, and parts of the North Side. Both groups understood that visibility and control meant safety, while weakness invited invasion. During the late 1970s, prison politics pushed these groups under the same banner called People Nation. That alliance included Stones, Kings, Vice Lords, Latin Counts, and others, created mainly to survive incarceration. Shared symbols and non-aggression rules applied inside facilities where enemies lived stacked together under watchful guards. On paper, People Nation meant cooperation against Folk Nation rivals like Gangster Disciples or Spanish Cobras. Outside prison walls, however, those rules depended on money, territory, and ego staying quiet. For a while, the alliance worked loosely, especially when older members still carried weight. Some neighborhoods even saw Stones and Kings fighting side by side against common enemies during the late 1970s. That balance started shifting once younger members began caring more about corners than alliances. Crack cocaine markets exploded during the 1980s, turning sidewalks into revenue streams worth killing over. At that point, ideology lost value, replaced by control, respect, and retaliation. By the mid-80s, Stone sets operated independently, answering more to block reputation than People Nation ideology. Latin King sections did the same, focusing on expansion and dominance within mixed neighborhoods. When Black and Latino populations overlapped, friction replaced cooperation, especially where housing projects forced proximity. Street interactions became tests of dominance rather than reminders of shared alliances. Every stare, rumor, or shouted insult became a potential ignition. Prison continued shaping this dynamic, but not how the founders intended. Inside, People Nation symbolism still mattered, yet outside, younger dudes rarely cared about agreements made behind bars. Money changed loyalty faster than speeches ever could, especially when leadership was distant or locked away. By the late 1980s, respect mattered more than history, while territory mattered more than ideology. That shift quietly set the conditions for conflict long before anyone called it a war. By the time the People Nation alliance settled into routine during the late 1970s, its meaning already depended on where you stood physically. Inside prisons, Stones and Kings followed the same symbols, same hand signs, same coded language, because survival demanded structure. Outside those walls, young members learned the streets block by block, not through charters or manifestos. What mattered was who controlled the corner you walked past after school, who watched the alley at night, and who would press you first. That gap between paperwork loyalty and street reality widened quietly without meetings or declarations. During the early 1980s, Chicago neighborhoods started shifting fast, especially on the south and northwest sides. Housing projects mixed populations that once stayed separate, forcing Black and Latino families into close proximity. Kids grew up sharing schools, buses, and playgrounds, but also competing for respect in tight spaces. When crews overlapped, alliances mattered less than reputation carried from one block to the next. Younger Stones and Kings judged each other by presence, not by People Nation history. Uptown and Albany Park showed this tension early, long before headlines caught on. Latino and Black gangs lived within walking distance, sometimes on the same streets. Familia Stones, made up largely of Puerto Rican members, tried to balance Stone identity with Latino proximity. That balance held briefly, but once the Latin King set expanded north, neutrality stopped making sense. When territory narrowed, friendship turned into friction without ceremony. South Chicago followed a similar pattern, but with heavier consequences. The area changed rapidly during the late 1980s as Latino families moved east toward the lake. Latin Kings filled that space quickly, establishing control near Commercial Avenue and Exchange. Black P. Stone sets also expanded nearby, pulling influence from South Shore and Woodlawn. Blocks sat too close for comfort, leaving no buffer zones where alliance rules could breathe. Young members on both sides rarely heard elders talk about the people nation's unity. Instead, they learned through everyday encounters that respect meant dominance. Being seen too often on the wrong side of a street brought attention nobody wanted. Words exchanged casually turned into rumors, then into challenges that demanded a response. Each interaction added pressure, making cooperation feel unrealistic. Prison politics did little to fix this disconnect. Older members still honored People Nation codes while locked up, but their authority faded outside. Younger dudes did not wait for instructions from people serving decades behind bars. They learned quickly that street credibility came from action, not affiliation. Once drug corners entered the picture, patience disappeared completely. Crack cocaine reshaped everything during the 1980s, especially in working-class neighborhoods. Sidewalks became business locations, and crews guarded them fiercely. Latin King sets ran profitable corners in South Chicago, Humboldt Park, and Pilsen. Black Pea Stone sets sought the same opportunities wherever they could secure space. When money flowed through a block, alliances became obstacles rather than protection. Recruitment followed the same logic. Schools fed both organizations with teenagers looking for identity and protection. When a Stone was recruited from a mixed area, the Kings noticed immediately. When Kings tagged near Stone territory, a response followed quickly. Each new recruit became a statement, increasing tension without formal confrontation. That competition built resentment quietly, turning alliance language hollow. Street culture reinforced this separation. Slang, clothing choices, and local reputations mattered more than national symbols. Young members identified as Stone or King first, People Nation second, if at all. Respect meant knowing where you stood, not who your allies were supposed to be. Walking through rival territory invited testing, regardless of alliance banners hanging somewhere else. Early clashes rarely made the news, but they mattered deeply within neighborhoods. Fist fights outside schools turned into beatdowns after dark. Drive-by threats escalated from words to gunfire without warning. Each incident added memory, teaching younger members what to expect next time. Nobody needed official permission to respond. By the early 1990s, older leadership struggled to keep control. Attempts at mediation happened quietly, often through prison messages or trusted intermediaries. Those efforts failed more often than they succeeded, since local beef carried more weight. Younger members viewed truces as weakness, not wisdom. Once blood spilled, respect demanded retaliation. The idea of People Nation unity survived mostly as symbolism. 5-point stars still appeared in graffiti, but meanings changed locally. A star no longer promised safety when walking unfamiliar blocks. It became background noise to real-life danger. Alliance language stayed intact, but trust disappeared. In neighborhoods like South Chicago, violence settled into routine. Shootings happened late at night, early morning, sometimes in broad daylight. Residents learned patterns, knowing when to stay inside or leave quickly. Police reports rarely mentioned alliances, only labeling incidents as gang-related. On the street, everyone knew which sides were involved. This breakdown happened without a single spark or declaration. No meeting announced war between the Stones and Kings. Instead, tension accumulated through daily encounters, misunderstood gestures, and territorial pressure. Proximity bred suspicion, while profit fueled aggression. Over time, peace stopped feeling practical. By the mid-90s, People Nation still existed in theory, but street enforcement vanished. Younger members never experienced genuine alliance cooperation. They grew up hearing only stories, often framed as outdated or irrelevant. Loyalty shifted toward immediate crews, not historical agreements. That shift made conflict inevitable. Prison continued shaping identities, but it no longer controlled outcomes. Inside, Stones and Kings followed people-nation rules to avoid chaos. Outside, those same individuals returned to neighborhoods already burning with resentment. The transition exposed how fragile alliance loyalty really was. Survival inside did not translate to peace outside. As drug markets expanded and recruitment intensified, mutual suspicion hardened. Stones saw Kings as competition blocking expansion. Kings viewed the Stones as encroachers disrespecting established control. Neither side trusted the other to honor unwritten rules. Every move felt like provocation. By the late 1990s, alliances remained technically intact, but emotionally empty. People Nation existed as a name, not a practice. Younger members recognized symbols without believing in promises attached to them. The streets operated on proximity, power, and response. That hollow alliance lingered quietly, waiting for something to expose its weakness fully. That exposure would come later, not through ideology, but through bloodshed that made neutrality impossible. By the late 1980s, the gap between alliance language and street behavior finally turned visible through violence that nobody wanted to name publicly. In South Chicago, small incidents began carrying weight beyond the people directly involved, changing how neighborhoods interpreted every gunshot. A killing stopped being viewed as random once familiar faces appeared at candlelight memorials and school hallways. Each death quietly tested whether People Nation unity meant anything beyond prison walls. What followed did not explode instantly, but it settled in slowly through memory and response. South Chicago became one of the earliest pressure points because the territory there left no room for misunderstanding. Latin King sets already controlled stretches near Commercial Avenue and Exchange by the late 1980s. Black P. Stone sets, including newer factions moving east from South Shore, pushed closer during the same period. Blocks that once acted as informal buffers disappeared as families relocated and housing patterns shifted. That proximity created constant contact, which turned small disputes into lasting grudges. The first killings rarely made headlines, but people on the blocks remembered names clearly. A shooting at a corner store or gas station did not end when police tape came down. Friends replayed the event, reshaping it through retellings that emphasized disrespect or cowardice. Those stories moved faster than facts, reaching younger members before elders could intervene. Memory hardened quicker than investigation. In Albany Park on the northwest side, similar dynamics played out slightly earlier, setting an example others noticed. The emergence of familiar Stones, largely Puerto Rican members tied loosely to Stone identity, complicated relationships further. Latin King's expansion into the area during the early 1990s tested neutrality immediately. When a Latin King known as Renegade was killed around 1994, the response followed fast. Retaliation arrived through the murder of a Stone member called Widget, signaling that alliance language had limits. Those two deaths mattered less for their numbers than their meaning. Each killing served as proof that shared affiliation no longer prevented bloodshed. Retaliation logic activated quickly, teaching crews how to respond going forward. Nobody waited for permission, since silence already felt like weakness. That lesson traveled far beyond Albany Park. Back on the south side, similar interpretations took shape without formal announcements. Shootings happened sporadically, sometimes months apart, but each one added tension. People began counting losses quietly, even when police reports avoided gang labels. A Latin King killed near Bush territory became a point of reference. A stone shot near the exchange carried equal weight. Tagging walls became part of that scorekeeping process. Names appeared spray-painted near alleys, accompanied by crowns or stars marking affiliation. Those tags acted as both memorials and warnings, reminding rivals that the dead were not forgotten. Young members learned which names mattered by seeing them repeated. Walls turned into history books written in paint. Stories passed through schools faster than through streets. Teenagers carried rumors from block to block, adding emotion to incomplete details. A fight during lunch could reference a shooting months earlier, tying personal conflict to broader beef. That connection made violence feel inherited rather than spontaneous. Every interaction gained history before it even happened. Leadership struggled to contain these reactions. Older members understood retaliation logic, but also recognized its cost. Their influence weakened as younger members trusted peers more than elders. Prison-based authority reached neighborhoods slowly, often distorted by rumor. By the time messages arrived, damage had already happened. The late 1980s and early 1990s also introduced a new way of remembering the dead. Instead of quiet mourning, crews turned losses into identity markers. Nicknames replaced legal names, making victims symbols rather than individuals. Shirts, graffiti, and verbal shout-outs reinforced loyalty. That ritualization made backing down impossible. Police response during this period stayed limited and reactive. Many incidents went unsolved due to witness fear and neighborhood silence. That lack of accountability encouraged retaliation over legal resolution. Crews learned that street justice moved faster than courts. This lesson reinforced independence from authority. Violence remained sporadic rather than constant, which made it more dangerous. Periods of calm fooled outsiders into thinking tensions eased. Underneath, grudges accumulated quietly, waiting for opportunity. When shootings happened, they felt sudden but rarely unexpected locally. The rhythm taught patience and planning. Drug markets intensified the meaning of these early killings. A murder near a profitable corner threatened income streams, raising the stakes further. Crews interpreted attacks as attempts to weaken control. That perception demanded a response regardless of alliance history. Money reinforced emotion, turning memory into strategy. Albany Park eventually cooled slightly by the mid-1990s, but the lesson stuck citywide. Younger members watched how violence reshaped power quickly. They learned that retaliation earned respect, while restraint invited pressure. Those lessons traveled through relatives, friends, and prison connections. Geography changed, but logic stayed intact. South Chicago absorbed those lessons deeply. Each sporadic killing refined expectations for future conflict. Crews learned to move deliberately, avoiding reckless exposure. They also learned how quickly things could spiral once blood spilled. That knowledge prepared them for larger confrontations ahead. By the early 1990s, people-nation unity existed mostly through language rather than practice. Older members still referenced shared history, but younger ones felt disconnected. Every new death pushed that history further away. The alliance became something discussed, not lived. These first bodies did not launch a war overnight. Instead, they trained both sides in how conflict would unfold later. Retaliation logic became normalized, memory became weaponized, and neutrality disappeared quietly. What followed built directly on these early moments, shaped by lessons learned without instruction. By the early 1990s, the conflict stopped revolving around pride alone, since money started shaping decisions faster than history ever could. Drug sales turned ordinary blocks into steady income streams, changing how crews valued space. A corner meant product movement. lookout positions, and customers who returned daily. Once profit entered the picture, losing ground felt like losing livelihood. That shift quietly rewired priorities across South Chicago, Humboldt Park, and surrounding areas. Black P. Stone sets adjusted quickly, especially after centralized leadership faded following Jeff Fort's imprisonment. Without a voice-controlling strategy, individual crews handled business independently. Each set protected its own interests, reacting to local pressure rather than citywide politics. Latin King sections followed similar paths, despite their stronger hierarchy on paper. Street commanders focused on earnings and dominance within their immediate surroundings. The drug economy created urgency where patience once existed. Corners demanded constant visibility, which increased exposure and tension. Every unfamiliar face became a potential threat or opportunity. Movement through neighborhoods required calculation rather than habit. Young members learned routes, timing, and blind spots early. This economic pressure pushed conflict into everyday routines. Going to school, visiting family, or hitting a store required awareness of shifting boundaries. Blocks that seemed neutral yesterday felt hostile the next morning. Violence did not spike suddenly, but it appeared more often through smaller incidents. Gunshots replaced fistfights as warnings. Shootings during this period rarely made front-page news. Many incidents occurred late at night, early morning, or in isolated areas. Police reports described victims without naming affiliations. Residents filled the gaps with speculation and memory. That quiet cycle allowed violence to continue without public scrutiny. Drug markets also changed how retaliation worked. A shooting no longer represented personal disrespect alone. It signaled an attempt to disrupt business or weaken control. Responses became strategic rather than emotional, though anger still fueled action. Crews planned responses carefully, choosing timing and location deliberately. Recruitment intensified under these conditions. Drug operations needed manpower for sales, security, and enforcement. Teenagers filled those roles quickly, attracted by money and protection. Each new recruit increased territorial pressure, expanding influence outward. That expansion invited challenge from rivals watching closely. Independent decision-making increases risk. Without centralized approval, retaliation happened faster. One shooting triggered another before leadership could intervene. That speed rewarded aggression, reinforcing violent habits. Over time, the restraint felt unrealistic. In South Chicago, specific corridors became especially volatile. Areas near Exchange Avenue, Commercial, and Burley saw repeated incidents. Latin King and Black P. Stone sets operated within blocks of each other. Customers crossed boundaries unintentionally, creating confusion and suspicion. Violence followed these misunderstandings closely. Humboldt Park experienced similar dynamics, though with different players. Latin Kings guarded established markets aggressively, wary of any encroachment. Stone-affiliated crews passing through drew attention quickly. Surveillance became informal yet constant. Eyes watched every movement. The normalization of gunfire changed how communities reacted. Residents learned to differentiate between random noise and danger signals. Sirens no longer brought crowds outside. People stayed inside, avoiding involvement. That silence helped conflict continue unnoticed. Street storytelling adapted to this environment. Shooters gained reputations quietly through word of mouth rather than media coverage. Names circulated through schools, parties, and jail visits. Respect attached itself to action rather than rank. Younger members chased recognition through visible moves. Violent repetition shaped expectations. A single shooting no longer shocked deeply affected neighborhoods. It became part of the rhythm rather than a disruption. That normalization reduced hesitation around pulling triggers. When violence feels routine, decision thresholds drop. Drug profits also funded better weapons. Firearms became easier to access through underground markets. Semi-automatic pistols replaced revolvers, increasing damage potential. Ammunition flowed steadily through informal networks. Firepower changed street calculus dramatically. Competition for territory sharpened attention to detail. Crews tracked rival schedules, habits, and weak points. Retaliation targeted individuals tied to operations rather than symbolic figures. Violence aimed to disrupt functionality. This strategic approach marked a shift from earlier expressive acts. The absence of headlines created a feedback loop. Without public pressure, law enforcement responded slowly. Investigations stalled due to a lack of witnesses. That gap encouraged street justice. Crews trusted their own methods more than institutions. Momentum built through repetition rather than escalation. Shootings occurred at similar intensity over long stretches. Each incident reinforced norms rather than raising stakes. Over time, violence felt expected, almost inevitable. That expectation shaped behavior on both sides. Leadership fragmentation worsened under economic pressure. Elders lacked authority over younger earners controlling revenue streams. Money shifted power downward. Decision-making decentralized further. Control eroded quietly. Latin King hierarchy still existed formally, but enforcement varied locally. Some sections followed strict rules, others operated loosely. Stone sets already functioned independently. That asymmetry created unpredictability. Rivals never knew who would respond or how. Drug markets also blurred boundaries between gangs. Independent dealers loosely affiliated with crews for protection. These individuals sometimes sparked incidents unintentionally. Their actions pulled gangs into conflicts they did not initiate. Complexity increased alongside profit. Everyday movement turned into a risk assessment. Walking paths changed frequently to avoid exposure. Cars slowed near certain intersections. Eyes scanned rooftops and porches instinctively. Life adjusted around danger. Violence education happened informally. Younger members learned through observation rather than instruction. They watched how retaliation played out. They memorized consequences without lectures. Experience replaced guidance. Over time, the idea of territory shifted completely. Blocks became investments rather than homes. Protecting them justified extreme measures. Losing them felt catastrophic. That mindset hardened attitudes permanently. Around the same time, high schools quietly became the most efficient transfer points for street conflict, especially in neighborhoods already carrying unresolved tension. Bowen High School sat inside that pressure, pulling students from South Chicago blocks tied to both Stones and Kings. Teenagers walked through the same doors every morning, carrying histories they did not create but could not escape. Hallways forced proximity, which made silence feel like surrender and eye contact feel like a challenge. Teachers saw arguments, but students felt legacy. Inside those schools, identity formed quickly through association rather than instruction. Students learned who belonged to which block through whispers, clothing choices, and lunchtime seating patterns. A cousin's reputation mattered more than report cards. Being neutral rarely lasted, since peers expected loyalty once affiliations became visible. Social pressure did most of the recruiting work. Hallway confrontations often started small, but context gave them weight. A shoulder bump carried meaning once connected to a shooting months earlier. Verbal exchanges referenced names of the dead without explaining why they mattered. Those references tied personal disputes to broader conflict instantly. After school, those tensions followed students home. The walk away from campus acted as a transition from words to action. Groups formed naturally, moving together toward bus stops or neighborhood streets. Encounters continued without supervision, often escalating quickly. A fight outside school could trigger phone calls across blocks within minutes. What happened near the lockers frequently echoed later that evening. Parents often understood the danger, but struggled to intervene. Many grew up around earlier phases of the same conflict. Advice sounded outdated to teenagers raised under different conditions. Moving away was rarely affordable. Staying meant adapting. Schools also created visibility for younger figures who later played larger roles. Reputation formed early through fights, loyalty displays, and willingness to stand ground. Those traits earned attention from older members watching closely. Recruitment happened quietly, sometimes through family, sometimes through peers. No speeches were needed. Bowen was not unique, but it became symbolic later. Other schools like Hyde Park Academy and Harper carried similar dynamics. Students crossed boundaries daily, linking neighborhoods through attendance zones. That movement spread information faster than street gossip alone. Conflicts traveled with students. Fear shaped behavior as much as loyalty. Students learned which hallways to avoid and which exits offered safety. Seating choices became strategic. Friend groups doubled as protection units. Even silence communicated alignment. After school, confrontations acted as spark points rather than conclusions. A fistfight might end quickly, but consequences unfolded later. Friends called older relatives. Blocks responded to perceived disrespect. Violence followed predictable paths once triggered. This pattern repeated enough times to feel routine. Students understood the sequence without explanation. An argument today suggested danger tomorrow. That expectation created tension even during calm periods. Peace felt temporary. Teachers and administrators tried interventions, but influence remained limited. Suspensions removed individuals without changing conditions. Security presence shifted incidents off campus rather than preventing them. Students learned to wait until supervision disappeared. The conflict adapted. Youth identity hardened through repetition. Teens inherited names, grudges, and expectations through family stories. Older siblings set examples through absence or incarceration. Those lessons carried weight beyond lectures. Experience shaped worldview. Schools also served as meeting grounds for different sets within the same organization. Stone members from separate blocks interacted daily, forming bonds that later influenced street alliances. King sections did the same. These connections strengthened internal networks. Coordination improved quietly. Social events amplified risk. Basketball games, dances, and assemblies brought large groups together. Tension increased when rival neighborhoods attended. Police presence reduced the incidents temporarily. Once events ended, the streets absorbed the fallout. The late 1990s saw this cycle deepen. Younger teens entered schools already aware of reputations. Stories circulated before first-hand experience. That preloaded bias influenced reactions. Students judged each other through inherited lenses. Violence education happened through observation. Teens watched how older peers handled conflict. They noted who gained respect and who faded. Those outcomes guided behavior choices. Lessons stuck without formal instruction. Family ties complicated the separation between school and street. Brothers, cousins, and neighbors attended together. A conflict involving one student pulled relatives into response. That overlap erased boundaries between youth disputes and adult retaliation. Schools became entry points. Fear and loyalty intertwined tightly. Refusing involvement risked isolation or suspicion. Participation offered protection, but invited danger. Teens navigated that balance daily. Choices felt constrained. By the early 2000s, schools no longer acted as neutral spaces. They mirrored neighborhood dynamics closely. Administrators recognized patterns but lacked tools to break them. Students adapted faster than systems. The war passed down quietly through these spaces. No announcements declared continuation. Expectation alone sustained it. Youth stepped into roles shaped by history. Some students managed to avoid deeper involvement, but many did not. The environment narrowed options steadily. Even those who stayed clear carried awareness. That awareness shaped movement and behavior. By the time violence erupted publicly years later, the groundwork already existed. Schools had carried the conflict forward silently. Generations learned what loyalty required before understanding cost. That inheritance ensured continuity without intention. By February 2009, tension around Bowen High School had already been simmering long enough that students recognized warning signs without anyone explaining them. Small arguments carried extra weight that winter, especially between groups tied loosely to Stone and King neighborhoods nearby. Hallway disputes no longer ended with detention threats, since everyone understood what followed after dismissal. That afternoon started like many others, loud and restless, with frustration hanging heavy after weeks of unresolved pressure. Nobody walked in expecting headlines, yet nobody felt surprised when things went wrong. The first spark came from a fight inside the building, involving students connected to rival blocks near South Chicago. Words exchanged earlier that week resurfaced, fueled by rumors that had circulated through lunch tables and phone calls. Teachers tried separating students, but anger had already spread beyond the room. Friends took sides instinctively, based on neighborhood loyalty rather than the original argument. By the time security intervened, tension had moved outside supervision. Once dismissal hit, groups formed naturally as students left through different exits. Some headed toward bus stops, while others walked toward familiar streets. A handful followed rivals at a distance, watching movements closely. Phones buzzed with messages describing who was outside and where they headed. Information moved faster than authority. One group trailed another southbound, with emotions running hotter once school property disappeared behind them. Verbal exchanges continued, growing louder as numbers increased. Bystanders sensed danger and moved away, recognizing patterns seen before. This was no longer a school issue. The street took over. At some point during that movement, a decision formed that changed everything. A student later identified as a Black Keystone affiliate broke away briefly. He headed toward a nearby residence tied to his family. That house was familiar, not random, holding access to something far more serious. He did not act alone since his peers remained nearby, watching the situation unfold. Inside that residence, a rifle was retrieved, altering the stakes instantly. This was not about intimidation anymore. Carrying the weapon back toward the street signaled intent beyond posturing. Those nearby recognized the shift immediately. Fear mixed with adrenaline. As the armed student rejoined the group, the situation accelerated beyond anyone's control. Word spread quickly that a gun was present. Some ran, others froze, unsure which direction offered safety. The chase began shortly afterward, moving toward a cluster of students near 71st Street. Panic replaced argument. Witnesses later described chaos rather than coordination. Students scattered across sidewalks, ducking behind cars and fences. Shouting filled the air, mixing fear with confusion. The rifle fired multiple times, tearing through the crowd without discrimination. People dropped where they stood, while others escaped by inches. When the shooting stopped, the damage became clear quickly. 4 students were hit. 2 teenagers, both 16, collapsed and never got back up. Julian King and Darnell Williams died from gunshot wounds sustained during that brief burst of violence. Their death shocked families who had expected ordinary school days. The intended target survived, a fact that carried heavy symbolism later. That survival underscored how misdirected the violence had become. Innocent classmates paid the highest price. The logic of retaliation failed completely in that moment. Police arrived within minutes, locking down the area. Officers struggled to control crowds gathering around fallen students. Parents rushed toward the scene, searching faces for familiar features. Ambulances transported the wounded under heavy escort. News spread faster than official statements. Law enforcement response intensified immediately, marking a turning point. Detectives identified the shooter quickly through witness accounts and surveillance footage. Arrests followed within days, signaling seriousness rarely seen after earlier incidents. Charges included multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. This was no longer street justice. Media attention transformed the incident into a citywide reckoning. Headlines emphasized school violence rather than gang rivalry. Commentators debated safety and accountability. Politicians visited neighborhoods offering promises. For residents, none of this felt new. Within Stone and King circles, the reaction differed sharply. Some expressed anger at the recklessness involved. Others saw the outcome as inevitable, given years of tension. Quiet conversations questioned leadership and discipline. The incident forced reflection without resolution. The shooter, later identified as a Black P. Stone affiliate, faced life-altering consequences immediately. Court proceedings unfolded publicly, exposing details previously confined to street knowledge. Testimony described the sequence from fight to shooting. Evidence confirmed how quickly events escalated. Families of the victims struggled with grief that offered no clear target. Their children were not intended participants in a larger conflict. Mourning ceremonies filled churches and streets. Community members demanded answers without receiving comfort. Pain replaced politics. For schools, the shooting changed procedures overnight. Increased security presence followed, along with policy revisions. Students returned under surveillance that felt unnatural. Fear lingered longer than sirens. Classrooms carried silence heavier than lectures. Neighborhoods responded cautiously. Residents avoided gatherings near the area for weeks. Conversations lowered in volume. Street activity slowed briefly, not from peace, but from shock. That pause did not last. Within the gangs, interpretation mattered more than public narrative. Some framed the incident as a mistake rather than a warning. Others recognized that the exposure risk was increasing. Law enforcement pressure intensified across both groups. Surveillance expanded quietly. The shooting shattered illusions about containment. Violence once considered local spilled into public view. Schools no longer acted as buffers. Innocent casualties forced attention. Despite arrests, the underlying conflict remained unresolved. Retaliation did not stop permanently, but it adapted. The focus shifted toward avoiding exposure rather than avoiding violence. Lessons learned were tactical, not moral. The realization that the intended target survived carried bitter weight. That fact reinforced how random outcomes could become once weapons entered youth conflict. Death chose differently than intent. That randomness haunted neighborhoods long afterward. February 2009 became a reference point, marking a before and after moment. Stories referenced it without explanation. Younger members grew up hearing about it early, fear mixed with legend. Law enforcement also adjusted its approach. Task forces increased focus on South Chicago. Intelligence sharing improved between units. Gang labels returned to the official language. Pressure mounted. Residents recognized change without relief. The incident confirmed what many already knew. Youth conflict had reached a dangerous scale. Solutions felt distant. That day did not end the war, but it exposed its cost publicly. The consequences extended far beyond the shooter. 2 families buried son who never chose sides. That truth lingered heavily. The conflict moved forward carrying that weight, reshaped by attention, but not resolved by it. After the Bowen High School killings, Chicago institutions moved fast, signaling urgency through arrests, press conferences, and visible police saturation around South Chicago. Detectives worked aggressively, gathering statements, surveillance footage, and phone records tied to the February 2009 shooting. Prosecutors framed the case as school violence rather than gang conflict, aiming for broad accountability. Courtrooms filled with reporters, while politicians promised reforms meant to calm public fear. For the city, response meant action on record. The legal process unfolded methodically, following timelines unfamiliar to the neighborhoods most affected. Charges included first-degree murder, attempted murder, and weapons violations, carrying decades-long sentences. Court hearings stretched across months, sometimes years, pulling families back into pain repeatedly. Judges spoke carefully, focused on procedure rather than street context. Verdicts offered structure, not closure. Media coverage amplified certain details while ignoring others. Headlines emphasized rifles, campuses, and youth danger, rarely discussing decades of buildup. Interviews centered on grieving parents and shocked administrators. The broader feud remained background noise. That framing shaped public understanding while leaving street narratives untouched. On the blocks, reaction followed a different logic entirely. Arrests removed individuals, but they did not erase memory or obligation. Names of the incarcerated stayed alive through conversation and graffiti. Court outcomes mattered less than perceived disrespect. Debt remained unpaid regardless of the verdict. Witness fear played a major role in shaping outcomes beyond the courtroom. Many residents avoided cooperation, knowing consequences extended beyond legal boundaries. Silence protected families, but prolonged cycles. Investigations stalled when testimony disappeared. That absence reinforced reliance on street response. Rumors circulated quickly after the trials began. Some claimed retaliation plans were already underway. Others spoke of near misses and aborted attempts. Not every story proved true, but belief mattered more than accuracy. Anticipation fueled tension. Confirmed shootings followed quietly in the surrounding months. Incidents occurred late at night, away from schools and cameras. Police reports listed victims without context. Neighbors connected dots privately. Violence continued without announcement. Incarceration shifted dynamics without slowing momentum. Younger members filled gaps left by imprisoned figures. Leadership adapted quickly, redistributing responsibility. Operations resumed under new faces. The structure bent but did not break. Prison sentences altered personal futures, but not neighborhood expectations. Those locked away became symbols rather than absences. Their names carried weight, sometimes increasing pressure on those still free. Loyalty demanded continuity. Silence reinforced expectation. The city introduced prevention programs and increased patrols near schools. Officers monitored dismissal times closely. Students noticed the presence without feeling safer. Conflict adjusted schedules rather than ending. Streets absorbed pressure. Court proceedings created fatigue among families involved. Each appearance reopened wounds without resolving fear. Some stopped attending altogether. Life demanded continuation despite grief. That resignation mirrored street reality. Media attention faded as other stories replaced Bowen headlines. Without cameras, institutions relaxed their intensity. Funding shifted elsewhere. Neighborhoods noticed the withdrawal. Conflict resumed quietly. Within Stone and King circles, lessons focused on exposure reduction. Avoidance of schools and crowded areas increased. Communication moved offline. Tactics changed without reducing intent. Adaptation replaced restraint. Street logic treated court outcomes as irrelevant to debt. Justice felt incomplete without reciprocal action. That belief sustained cycles beyond legal reach. Momentum survived incarceration easily. Police intelligence units tracked activity closely but faced limitations. Cooperation remained scarce. Surveillance increased quietly. Arrests followed occasionally. Each removal created space for others. The idea of closure never took hold locally. Trials ended, but conversations continued. Memorials stayed fresh. Names repeated. Memory replaced resolution. Follow-up shootings reinforced continuity. Each incident reminded neighborhoods that Bowen was not an endpoint. Violence adapted shape and timing. Expectations adjusted accordingly. Institutions measured success through convictions and policy changes. Streets measured through response and reputation. Those metrics never aligned. That disconnect defined the aftermath. By late 2009, momentum felt unchanged despite visible intervention. Conflict operated below headlines. Silence protected survival while sustaining tension. The city reacted decisively. The streets kept moving. By the opening month of 2010, the aftermath of Bowen never cooled into stability, instead breaking apart into something less predictable and harder to map clearly. Arrests and convictions removed visible figures, yet the pressure they left behind drifted outward through neighborhoods already conditioned to expect retaliation. Without centralized leadership directing responses, violence traveled through informal relationships built on proximity, loyalty, and shared memory rather than formal command. Younger members stepped forward through presence and action, not appointment or recognition, reshaping how retaliation unfolded and where it appeared. During this period, shootings no longer followed a recognizable back-and-forth sequence tied to a single incident or decision point. Acts of violence appeared scattered across the far south side, disconnected publicly yet understood locally as part of the same unresolved tension. A shooting in one pocket triggered movement elsewhere, sometimes immediately, sometimes weeks later, without obvious coordination. Communication relied on word of mouth, brief calls, and personal encounters rather than structured planning, making responses unpredictable and difficult to anticipate. The case of Romelo Golden became one of several reference points during this stretch, illustrating how younger figures filled the space left by incarceration. Golden, tied to Stone-affiliated circles, faced serious charges connected to a deadly shooting that circulated heavily through neighborhood conversation. His name carried weight not because it resolved anything, but because it embodied consequence, ambition, and warning simultaneously. Young members read his situation through street logic rather than legal explanation, drawing lessons shaped by proximity rather than principle. What stood out most during these years was how loosely connected cliques operated under shared names without shared strategy. Stone sets function independently across South Shore, South Chicago, and nearby corridors, responding to local incidents without consulting other sections. Latin King groups mirrored this behavior, prioritizing immediate surroundings over broader coordination. Messages traveled unevenly, often arriving too late to influence outcomes, reinforcing fragmentation over unity. Violence during this phase rarely announced itself loudly or dramatically. Many shootings occurred late at night or early morning, away from schools, main roads, and heavy police presence. Victims often held indirect or peripheral connections to earlier conflicts, confusing outsiders and complicating investigations. Locals filled those gaps by tracing relationships in history rather than isolated events, keeping meaning alive through memory. Younger shooters gained recognition through visibility and follow-through rather than formal rank or title. Standing ground during confrontations earned attention quickly within peer groups who watched closely. Carrying out retaliation without hesitation elevated status locally, reinforcing expectation rather than discipline. Authority came from action rather than endorsement, reshaping how influence functioned. The absence of centralized control increased the frequency of mistakes during confrontations. Misidentification became more common, pulling unintended targets into cycles they never anticipated. A wrong assumption at a party, bus stop, or gas station triggered consequences far beyond the original dispute. Those errors deepened resentment and widened the conflict's reach, ensuring nobody felt insulated. Racial tension sharpened noticeably throughout this period, especially in areas experiencing rapid demographic change and housing turnover. Black and Latino residents lived closer together, sharing streets without shared trust or familiarity. Gang identity amplified that divide, turning everyday encounters into tests of allegiance and intent. Suspicion extended beyond crews, affecting unaffiliated residents navigating the same space. Schools reflected this tension quietly, though less publicly than during the Bowen period. Students adjusted routes, avoided certain peers, and tightened friend groups instinctively. Teachers noticed changes in behavior and atmosphere without understanding the underlying causes. Pressure followed students home, reinforcing street influence through daily routine. Law enforcement struggled to track these shifts accurately using traditional frameworks. Intelligence units focused on hierarchies that no longer existed in recognizable form. Patterns dissolved upon investigation, frustrating response efforts. Arrests followed individual incidents without preventing subsequent violence, reinforcing limitations. Street logic adapted faster than institutional policy during these years. Members learned to avoid predictable behavior, rotating meeting spots and altering schedules frequently. Communication moved offline deliberately, reducing digital traces and surveillance exposure. Planning remained informal yet intentional, emphasizing survival over spectacle. Neighborhoods felt the strain continuously, even during quieter stretches. Residents heard gunfire without knowing its origin or purpose. Trust eroded between neighbors, unsure of affiliations or intentions. Silence increased, protecting families while enabling cycles to continue without interruption. The years between 2010 and 2012 carried a sense of diffusion rather than climax or escalation. Violence spread thinner but wider, touching more blocks without concentrating attention. Each incident reinforced expectation rather than shock, deepening normalization. Communities adapted routines around danger. Younger members entering during this period inherited a conflict already fragmented and unresolved. They learned rules through observation and experience rather than instruction. Stories replaced guidance, shaping perception before direct involvement. Reputation mattered immediately, narrowing choices early. Quiet attempts at mediation occurred occasionally through family connections or respected elders. Those efforts rarely held for long under sustained pressure. Without shared authority, agreements lacked enforcement and credibility. One incident unraveled weeks of relative calm. The prison system continued to influence dynamics indirectly throughout this phase. Incarcerated members maintained influence through letters, visits, and intermediaries. Messages arrived filtered, delayed, and reinterpreted. Control remained partial, unable to override street momentum. By late 2011, retaliatory acts appeared disconnected publicly but linked privately through shared memory and association. Names resurfaced repeatedly during conversations, reinforcing continuity. Each shooting referenced earlier ones implicitly, expanding the narrative without structure. The conflict grew broader rather than deeper. The Golden Case, alongside others during this period, reinforced the belief that incarceration never equaled resolution. Sentences removed individuals but preserved motive and expectation. Younger peers absorbed lessons selectively, balancing fear with ambition. Consequence became a reference rather than a deterrent. As 2012 approached, fatigue settled across neighborhoods without producing peace or resolution. Residents adjusted their routines permanently, accepting altered normalcy. Violence blended into the background awareness rather than immediate alarm. Expectations lowered quietly across generations. This phase demonstrated how conflict survived without leadership or coordination. Diffusion replaced direction as retaliation continued through habit rather than command. The war persisted not through planning, but through inheritance carried quietly forward. While all that was happening, federal attention shifted the conflict into a new phase that neither side had fully prepared for or understood clearly. RICO investigations and drug indictments targeted leadership layers that had survived local enforcement for decades. Federal prosecutors built cases slowly, relying on wiretaps, informants, and financial records rather than street patrol arrests. When indictments landed, they removed older figures who once balanced aggression with restraint. What followed was not calm, but instability. Long sentences stripped organizations of experienced voices that once enforced internal discipline, even while participating in violence themselves. These figures understood boundaries shaped by memory and consequence. Their absence left younger members without guidance or accountability. Power vacuums formed immediately, not through formal succession, but through competition and impulsive decision-making. Authority became temporary and contested. In Stone-affiliated sets, the removal of older leadership accelerated fragmentation already underway. Independent crews operated without coordination, often ignoring long-standing internal rules. Younger members chased status through visibility rather than strategy. Violence lost purpose beyond immediate response. Recklessness replaced calculation. Latin King sections experienced similar strain despite a historically stronger hierarchy. Federal cases dismantled command structures that once maintained order. Leaders managing operations from prison faced tighter restrictions. Communication slowed or collapsed entirely. Local sections acted autonomously, often contradicting broader interests. Federal pressure also shifted how violence manifested on the streets. Fear of long sentences reduced large-scale operations, but increased smaller impulsive acts. Shootings became less planned, driven by opportunity rather than strategy. Violence occurred without clear objectives. Habit replaced intention. Prison dynamics reinforced these patterns rather than calming them. Incarcerated members carried grievances into facilities already divided by race and affiliation. People the nation's symbolism still mattered inside, but tension remained constant. Conflicts followed individuals across institutions. Feuds survived through proximity. Inside prisons, younger inmates learned conflict history through stories rather than instruction. Older figures attempted mediation with limited reach. Authority fractured along facility lines. Retaliation took different forms behind bars, including assaults and intimidation. That energy fed back onto the streets. Communication between inside and outside continued despite restrictions. Messages traveled through visits, letters, and intermediaries. Information arrived delayed and distorted. Decisions based on incomplete context produced mistakes. Street actions sometimes contradicted prison intentions. Federal cases also disrupted drug markets significantly. Supply chains collapsed temporarily, creating competition over the remaining territory. Smaller crews fought harder over shrinking revenue. Violence followed scarcity rather than expansion. Pressure intensified locally. Communities felt this shift through unpredictability. Shootings occurred without warning or obvious motive. Residents struggled to interpret patterns. Trust eroded further as stability disappeared. Fear became ambient rather than event-driven. Law enforcement measured success through convictions and asset seizures. Neighborhoods measured outcomes through safety and predictability. Those perspectives rarely aligned. Removing leaders did not restore calm. It removed barriers. Media coverage highlighted major indictments, portraying progress through headlines. Cameras captured handcuffs and courtroom steps. Stories ended with sentencing dates. Streets experienced the aftermath differently. Chaos replaced structure quietly. Younger members adapted to this environment by lowering thresholds for action. Without elders enforcing limits, impulsivity increased. Disputes escalated faster. Retaliation cycles shortened. Consequences felt abstract. Violence during this period lacked the symbolism seen earlier. Acts carried less message, more reaction. Shootings happened over perceived slights rather than strategic objectives. Reputation still mattered, but context thinned, meaning diluted. Prison politics mirrored this decline. Without centralized control, internal disputes multiplied. Alliances fractured under pressure. Cooperation depended on circumstance rather than loyalty. Survival drove choices daily. The feud persisted through these channels, reinforced rather than resolved by federal intervention. Incarceration spread conflict geographically as members transferred facilities. Grievances followed. The system redistributed tension rather than containing it. By the mid-2000s, the conflict looked different but remained active. Violence lost coherence, but not presence. Habit sustained it where strategy once guided. Younger generations inherited instability without understanding its origin. Collapse replaced the command. This phase revealed the limits of enforcement, focused solely on removal. Without rebuilding the structure, the absence created space for disorder. The war continued, reshaped by pressure, but never ended. By the late 2000s, the conflict no longer looked like organized warfare, yet it remained present through habits, memory, and reputation carried quietly across changing neighborhoods. Streets that once hosted open confrontations now showed signs of redevelopment, new residents, and shifting economies. Despite those changes, old names still mattered, spoken carefully or typed indirectly. The war survived through reference rather than coordination, lingering beneath everyday life without clear direction. Social media became the primary space where old grievances stayed alive, reshaped for a younger audience raised on screens rather than corners. Instagram posts, Facebook comments, and later short videos carried coded language, emojis, and indirect threats. Younger members learned conflict history through captions and reposts, not face-to-face explanations. Online presence replaced physical dominance as the first layer of reputation. Arguments moved quickly from comments to the streets when pride was felt challenged. This digital layer changed how disrespect traveled, since posts reached audiences far beyond immediate neighborhoods. A diss shared online could inflame tensions across the South Side within minutes. Older members watched from a distance, often frustrated by the lack of restraint. Younger users chased visibility, sometimes without understanding the consequences tied to names they referenced. Attention became currency, even when rooted in misunderstanding. Neighborhoods themselves changed significantly during this period, especially through gentrification and displacement. Longtime residents moved away, replaced by newcomers unfamiliar with local history. Blocks that once carried weight lost visible markers of affiliation. Murals faded, tags disappeared, and routines shifted. That physical change did not erase memory, but it altered how conflict expressed itself. Despite fewer public confrontations, tension remained accessible through inherited grudges. Families remembered losses clearly, passing stories down casually. Those stories shaped identity before direct involvement occurred. Young people learned who belonged to which side long before choosing affiliation. That inheritance maintained continuity without active recruitment. The 2020 unrest following George Floyd's killing exposed unresolved racial and gang tension across Chicago. Protests, property damage, and police withdrawal created temporary power vacuums. Old boundaries blurred briefly as neighborhoods reacted to chaos. In some areas, long-dormant rivalries resurfaced under pressure. The moment revealed how quickly tension returned when order disappeared. During that period, rumors spread rapidly about alliances shifting or conflicts reigniting. Some claims proved exaggerated, others grounded in isolated incidents. Fear and uncertainty amplified perception beyond reality. Neighborhoods prepared defensively, recalling earlier patterns. Memory guided response more than instruction. Younger cliques emerged during this time with loose connections to older organizations. These groups referenced Stone or King history without direct lineage. Names carried weight even when structure did not. New members adopted symbols selectively, often misunderstanding the original meaning. Identity became aesthetic rather than organizational. These newer groups operated independently, focused on immediate surroundings rather than broader conflicts. Their disputes rarely followed historical logic completely, yet referencing old beefs lent credibility and intimidation. The past became a tool rather than a guide. That distortion confused outsiders and insiders alike. Violence during the late 2000s occurred sporadically, often tied to personal disputes amplified by online interaction. Shootings happened without a clear connection to earlier cycles, though narratives link them retroactively. Residents struggled to interpret patterns accurately. Fatigue replaced vigilance. Law enforcement adapted slowly to these changes, shifting focus towards social media monitoring. Arrests followed digital evidence more frequently. That approach addressed symptoms rather than roots. Removing individuals did little to settle inherited tension. The cycle continued quietly. Older members expressed frustration privately, recognizing loss of control over narrative and behavior. Their authority held little weight with younger users chasing online status. Attempts at guidance felt outdated. Generational gaps widened. Experience lost influence. Schools reflected these shifts through subtle changes rather than overt conflict. Students carried awareness shaped by social media rather than hallway encounters. Arguments started online before spilling into physical space. Administrators struggled to track origins. Prevention lagged behind adaptation. Neighborhood fatigue became more visible during this era. Residents avoided involvement actively, prioritizing personal stability over collective response. Silence increased not from fear alone, but exhaustion. People focused inward, limiting exposure. Community cohesion weakened. The war did not end through agreement or reconciliation. It faded unevenly through fragmentation and attrition. Older figures aged out or remained incarcerated. Younger ones drifted between identities. Conflict lost coherence without losing presence. Economic pressures also reshaped priorities. Survival demanded attention elsewhere. Hustles changed form. Blocks lost strategic value. That shift reduced large-scale confrontations without resolving resentment. Quiet replaced confrontation. Media coverage during this period rarely connected incidents to the historical context. Stories framed violence as isolated or random. Viewers lacked background. That absence reinforced the disconnect between public understanding and lived experience. Memory stayed local. As the early 2020s progressed, references to the conflict appeared more often as jokes, lyrics, or nostalgic posts. Humor masked pain without resolving it. Distance softened urgency while preserving awareness. The past lingered as a backdrop. Younger generations inherited fragments rather than full narratives. They recognized names without understanding their origin. That partial knowledge fueled confusion and misinterpretation. Conflict became abstract. Consequence felt distant. The war persisted through inertia rather than intent. Nobody declared continuation, yet nobody declared peace. Absence of resolution replaced closure. Exhaustion shaped outcomes more than decisions. This phase revealed how conflicts can outlive their causes. When structure dissolves, memory sustains tension. The war never really ended. It simply thinned, scattered, and waited quietly within changed streets. After 3 decades, the measurable impact sat plainly across neighborhoods that looked familiar yet felt permanently altered by accumulated absence. Lives were lost early. Others redirected into prisons, while families adjusted routines around missing faces and delayed phone calls. Streets carried names remembered through stories rather than presence, shaping identity long after activity faded. The conflict left fewer visible markers, but consequences stayed embedded in daily movement and expectation. Neither the Black Peace Stones nor the Latin Kings emerged with lasting control, stability, or security, despite years of effort and sacrifice. Territory shifted hands repeatedly without delivering safety or prosperity to those defending it. Leadership cycles ended in incarceration, aging, or irrelevance, leaving younger members without inheritance worth claiming. What remained was instability that outlasted ambition, offering little return for the commitment demanded. Prison sentences formed a parallel landscape of consequence, stretching across decades without resolving underlying tension. Incarceration removed individuals but preserved memory, allowing grievance to travel through visits, letters, and reputation. Families carried the weight alongside those locked away, adjusting to absence as normalcy. The system absorbed bodies while neighborhoods absorbed silence, neither delivering closure. Communities paid quietly through altered expectations and constrained choices that shaped entire generations without formal acknowledgement. Parents taught caution earlier, children learned roots rather than freedoms, and neighbors avoided involvement by necessity. Trust eroded not through a single betrayal, but through repetition of unresolved harm. Survival replaced optimism gradually, without announcement. Economic changes softened some pressure while introducing new forms of displacement and disconnect. Redevelopment altered landscapes without addressing the history embedded beneath fresh paint and signage. Longtime residents relocated, carrying memory elsewhere, while newcomers walked streets without context. That shift reduced confrontation, but never reconciled the resentment lingering beneath routine. The absence of winners became clear through patterns rather than declarations, visible in unchanged streets and repeated cycles of loss. Gains proved temporary, while consequences endured across time frames that outlasted any individual involvement. The conflict consumed energy without producing security, draining communities slowly rather than dramatically. Exhaustion replaced momentum as the defining force. Younger generations inherited fragments of the story without understanding its origin or full scope. Names circulated without context, symbols appeared without explanation, and identity became aesthetic rather than lived. That partial inheritance blurred meaning, making conflict feel abstract while consequences remained real. Memory thinned without disappearing. Returning indirectly to the opening scene, the after-school gunfire now reads differently with context restored through time. The chaos did not emerge suddenly, nor did it resolve anything permanently afterward. It represented accumulation rather than anomaly, shaped by decisions made long before those students arrived. Understanding replaces surprise, but certainty remains absent. The story closes without finality, reflecting continuity rather than resolution across altered neighborhoods and scattered memories. The war did not end through peace or victory, but through fragmentation and fatigue that left little worth claiming. What remained was absence, adaptation, and routine shaped around loss. Across 30 years, the only consistent outcome was that nobody truly won.